The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Lorenzo's family restaurant as a young Army staff sergeant walked through the door, her boots making soft clicks against the polished floor. She'd just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the military base nearby, and the thought of a warm meal had drawn her to this local favorite spot she'd heard so much about from her fellow soldiers. The restaurant was bustling with the usual dinner crowd, families chatting over plates of steaming pasta, couples sharing appetizers, and business people wrapping up their day over coffee. The aroma of garlic bread and marinara sauce filled the air, making her stomach rumble. She hadn't eaten since her quick breakfast at dawn. Standing at the entrance, still in her pristine military uniform, she noticed at least 7 empty tables scattered throughout the dining area. A young host behind the counter was arranging menus, seemingly busy, but not really doing much. The staff sergeant waited patiently, maintaining her usual professional posture, shoulders back, head high, the way she'd been trained. After what felt like an eternity but was probably closer to 5 minutes, the host finally looked up. Their eyes met, and something strange flickered across the host's face. Was it discomfort? Disdain? The staff sergeant couldn't quite place it, but something felt off about the interaction before it even began. "Hi, table for 1 please," she said with a warm smile, trying to push aside that nagging feeling in her gut. The host shuffled through some papers, avoiding direct eye contact. Sorry, there's going to be quite a wait," the host mumbled, scribbling something in their reservation book. "Probably about an hour, maybe longer." The staff sergeant glanced around again at the clearly empty tables. "Oh, I don't mind sitting at the bar if that's easier," she offered, trying to be accommodating. She'd been on her feet all day treating patients at the base medical facility, and all she wanted was a quiet meal before heading home. "The bar is, reserved for a private event tonight," the host replied quickly, still not meeting her eyes. Just then, the door chimed as another couple walked in, an older man and woman in casual clothing. The staff sergeant stepped aside to let them approach the host's stand. To her disbelief, the same host who had just told her about the long wait immediately brightened up. "Good evening. Table for 2. Right this way, please." The host grabbed 2 menus and led the couple to one of the empty tables, the very ones that had supposedly been unavailable just moments before. The staff sergeant stood there, her chest tightening as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She watched as 2 more groups entered and were promptly seated at unavailable tables. Each time, the host gave them the same bright welcome that had been noticeably absent during her interaction. As she waited, thinking maybe there had been some mistake, she overheard a conversation between 2 servers near the water station. "I can't believe she's still standing there," one whispered to the other. "Doesn't she get it? We don't serve." The rest of the sentence was lost in the restaurant noise, but its meaning was crystal clear. 20 more minutes passed. The staff sergeant remained standing there, her military training kicking in as she maintained her composure. She thought about all the times she treated wounded soldiers in the field, never once caring about their skin color. She thought about the oath she'd taken to serve her country, and how that same country's promise of equality felt hollow in this moment. Finally, after 45 minutes of watching others being seated ahead of her, she turned and walked out of the restaurant. The evening air had cooled considerably, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was already racing, not with thoughts of anger or revenge, but with something else entirely. A plan. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she would return, not as a victim of discrimination, but as someone ready to create change. What she had in mind would shock everyone, but not in the way they might expect. The drive home was quiet. She hadn't cried. She hadn't screamed. Instead, she pulled out her phone and made a few calls. By the time she pulled into her driveway, several pieces of her plan were already in motion. The restaurant staff had no idea what was coming, but by this time tomorrow, Lorenzo's family restaurant would never be the same. That night, as she sat in her modest apartment, The staff sergeant couldn't get the events at Lorenzo's out of her head. The kitchen light cast a soft glow as she stirred her cup of tea, replaying every moment of the humiliating experience. The half-eaten microwave dinner sat forgotten on her coffee table. She'd lost her appetite hours ago. Her phone buzzed with messages from concerned friends, but she needed this quiet time to process everything. Through her open window, she could hear crickets chirping and the distant sound of cars passing by. It was such a normal, peaceful evening, which made what happened feel even more surreal. She picked up the framed photo from her side table. It showed her unit during their last deployment. In the picture, they were all covered in dust and sweat, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning despite their exhaustion. Black, white, Hispanic, Asian. None of that mattered when you were treating wounded soldiers or helping local civilians. They were just people, working together, protecting each other. How can things be so different here at home? She whispered to herself, touching the photo gently. She thought about the young soldier she treated just that morning, a kid barely out of high school who'd sprained his ankle during training. He'd been so nervous about missing his first deployment, and she'd spent extra time reassuring him, never once thinking about anything except helping him heal. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was her commanding officer responding to her earlier message. "Count me in," the text read. "Already spoke with the others. We'll be there." A small smile crossed her face as she read the replies coming in from her fellow service members. None of them hesitated when she explained what happened and shared her plan. She walked to her closet and pulled out her dress uniform. It was perfectly pressed, medals and ribbons arranged precisely, each one telling a story of service, sacrifice, and dedication. As she ran her fingers over the medals, she remembered receiving them. No one had cared about her skin color when they pinned these on her chest. They cared about her actions, her character, her service. Sitting down at her small desk, she began writing. Not an angry social media post or a scathing review, but a letter. Her handwriting was steady as she chose her words carefully. This wasn't about revenge or public shaming. It was about education, about opening eyes and changing hearts. Her neighbors probably wondered why her light stayed on so late that night. The staff sergeant worked through every detail of her plan. She made more calls, sent more messages, and refined her approach. Tomorrow wouldn't be about confrontation. It would be about conversation. About showing the restaurant staff something they clearly needed to see. Looking at her clock, she realized it was almost midnight. She had an early shift at the base medical facility, but sleep felt impossible. She walked to her window and looked out at the quiet street below. Somewhere out there was the restaurant owner, probably having no idea what had happened in their establishment that day. Tomorrow, they would learn, but not in the way they might expect. As she finally prepared for bed, she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at her wasn't angry or defeated. Instead, she saw determination, strength, and something else. Hope. Hope that tomorrow's actions might prevent someone else from experiencing what she did. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could turn this horrible experience into something positive. She set her alarm and laid out everything she'd need for the next day. Her dress uniform hung ready by the door. Her letter sat sealed on the desk. Her phone contained dozens of supportive messages from fellow service members who would stand with her tomorrow. As she finally drifted off to sleep, her last thoughts weren't of anger or revenge, but of change. Real, lasting change that could start with just one person deciding to respond to hatred with dignity and grace. What she didn't know was that her response to this situation would soon become a story that would inspire thousands, showing how one person's choice to rise above discrimination could transform not just a restaurant, but an entire community's perspective. Tomorrow would be a day that no one at Lorenzo's family restaurant would ever forget, but for reasons none of them could possibly expect. The morning light streamed through the base medical facility windows as the staff sergeant wrapped up her shift. Despite getting little sleep, She had thrown herself into her work, treating each patient with the same care and dedication she always did. Her colleagues noticed something was different about her today. A quiet intensity in her eyes, an extra straightness in her posture. During her lunch break, she sat alone in the break room, picking at her sandwich while reading the messages flooding her phone. Word had spread through the base about what happened at Lorenzo's. The support was overwhelming. Soldiers from different units, ranks, and backgrounds, all volunteering to stand with her. She had to remind several eager young privates that this wasn't about causing trouble or seeking revenge. "You sure about this?" asked one of the senior nurses, sliding into the chair across from her. The nurse had been in the military for 20 years and had seen her share of discrimination. "Nobody would blame you for filing a formal complaint instead." The staff sergeant looked up from her phone, a small smile crossing her face. "I'm sure. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness isn't with more darkness, it's with light." She pulled out the letter she'd written last night, now neatly folded in her uniform pocket. They need to see us as people, not just uniforms or colors. As her shift ended, she headed to the locker room to change into her dress uniform. Each button she fastened felt like armor, not for battle, but for something more important. Her hands moved automatically, adjusting her ribbons and medals with practiced precision. In the mirror, she saw not just herself, but every service member who had ever faced discrimination while wearing this uniform. The base parking lot was unusually busy for this time of day. Nearly 24 service members, all in their dress uniforms, stood waiting. They represented every rank, every department, every background imaginable. Some she knew well, others she'd never met before today. But they all shared the same determined expression. Her commanding officer stepped forward, his silver hair catching the afternoon sun. "Ready?" he asked simply. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. As they drove toward Lorenzo's in a convoy of cars, the staff sergeant thought about what she would say. She'd rehearsed her speech 100 times, but now different words were forming in her mind. Words about unity, about service, about the incredible bonds that form when people look past their differences to see each other's humanity. They parked across the street from the restaurant, and for a moment, she just sat there, watching customers go in and out. Regular people enjoying regular meals, unaware that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The nervousness from last night had been replaced by a calm certainty. One by one, her fellow service members gathered around her car. Nobody spoke, they didn't need to. Their presence said everything. Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, they stood together, a living testament to what America could be at its best. The staff sergeant took one last deep breath and stepped out of her car. The letter felt warm in her pocket, like it was alive with the words she'd poured into it the night before. As she looked at the restaurant's entrance, the same door that had been used to exclude her yesterday, she felt no anger, no desire for revenge. Instead, she felt something much more powerful. The determination to turn a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for transformation. What waited inside those doors had no idea what was coming. Not a confrontation, not a scene, but something far more impactful. As she straightened her uniform one last time and began walking toward the entrance, flanked by her fellow service members, she knew that today's events would ripple far beyond this one restaurant in this one town. Sometimes, the most powerful response to hatred isn't more hatred. It's showing people a better way forward. The afternoon sun glinted off their medals and insignias as they approached the door, a sight that would be forever etched in the memory of everyone who witnessed what happened next. The bell above Lorenzo's door chimed as the staff sergeant stepped inside, followed by her fellow service members. The bustling lunch crowd fell silent, forks pausing midway to mouths, conversations trailing off into stunned quiet. The sight of 24 service members in full dress uniforms commanded attention without a single word being spoken. The same post from yesterday stood at the podium, mouth slightly open, color draining from their face as recognition dawned. Behind them, servers stopped mid-stride, trays balanced in their hands. The clatter of kitchen noise continued for a moment before that too faded into silence. "Good afternoon," the staff sergeant said, her voice clear and steady. "I'd like to speak with the owner, please." There was no anger in her tone, just quiet authority, the kind that came from years of serving others and leading by example. A busboy practically ran to the back, and moments later, a middle-aged man emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. He was the owner. You could tell by the way he carried himself, though right now he looked uncertain, glancing between the uniformed group and his clearly uncomfortable staff. "I'm the owner," he said, stepping forward. "How can I help you?" His eyes darted to the host, who was now staring intently at the floor. The staff sergeant reached into her pocket and withdrew her letter. "Sir, yesterday, I came to your restaurant as a customer. Today, I'm here as a soldier, a medical professional, and a human being who believes in the power of understanding." The owner's forehead creased in confusion, but he listened as she continued. The restaurant remained silent except for her voice, which carried to every corner without having to be raised. "Every day at the base medical facility, I treat soldiers of all backgrounds. When they're hurt, bleeding, scared, nobody cares about skin color. We care about saving lives, about helping each other, about being human." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Yesterday, your staff denied me service because of how I look. Today, I've brought some people I'd like you to meet." One by one, her fellow service members stepped forward. A combat medic who had saved dozens of lives in Afghanistan. A helicopter pilot who flew rescue missions during natural disasters. A surgeon who had performed emergency operations under enemy fire. Each one shared a brief story of unity, of lives saved, of barriers broken. The owner's face transformed as he listened. Horror, shame, and understanding crossed his features in waves. Some customers had tears in their eyes. A few were filming with their phones, but most were simply watching, transfixed by this unexpected lesson in humanity. "Sir," the staff sergeant said, handing him the letter, "this isn't about punishment or public shame. It's about growth. In this letter, I've written some suggestions about how your restaurant could become a leader in showing that food, like service to our country, knows no color." The owner's hands trembled slightly as he took the letter. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and his shoulders slumped. I had no idea this was happening in my restaurant," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This isn't what we stand for. This isn't what I stand for." The host tried to slip away quietly, but the owner noticed. "Don't leave," he said firmly. "You need to hear this too. We all do." He turned back to the staff sergeant and her companions. "Please, would you all stay? Share a meal with us? I want to hear more about your experiences, your suggestions. I want to make this right." The tension in the room shifted to something else. Hope, possibility, the sense of witnessing something important. As tables were pushed together to accommodate the group, other customers stood up and applauded. A few even asked if they could join the conversation. What had started as a response to discrimination was becoming something much more. A moment of community, of understanding, of change. The staff sergeant watched as her fellow service members took seats alongside restaurant staff and customers, already beginning to share stories and build bridges. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice isn't force or anger. It's the simple act of showing people their own humanity reflected in others. As she sat down at the newly arranged table, she knew that this day would be remembered not for the wrong that had been done, but for how it had been made right. The afternoon sun streamed through Lorenzo's windows as the impromptu gathering took shape. The owner had closed the restaurant to new customers, focusing entirely on this unexpected moment of transformation. Kitchen staff emerged from the back, removing their aprons to join the conversation. Even the host, who had turned the staff surgeon away yesterday, sat quietly, listening, their earlier smugness replaced by visible shame. "Tell me," the owner said, his voice carrying across the now joined tables, "what it's like serving together." His eyes were focused, genuine, taking in every face before him, each one telling a different story of service and sacrifice. A young private spoke up first, her voice slightly shaky but growing stronger. "On my first deployment, I was terrified," she said. "I was just a small-town girl who'd never left home. But my staff surgeon here," she gestured to the woman who'd been denied service, "she looked out for me. When I got sick from the heat, she stayed with me all night in the medical tent. Never once did I think about what she looked like. I just knew she had my back." Other stories followed. A lieutenant shared how they'd celebrated holidays on base, mixing traditions and foods from different cultures. A medic described treating local children in war-torn villages, where compassion needed no translation. Each story wove together, creating a tapestry of shared humanity that was impossible to ignore. The staff surgeon watched as faces around the room changed. The defensive masks worn by some staff members began to crack. One server wiped tears from her eyes. A cook who'd been standing stiffly by the kitchen door gradually moved closer, pulled in by the stories. "I've been running this restaurant for 20 years, the owner said, his voice thick with emotion. "My father started it, taught me that food brings people together. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that." He turned to face his staff. "But that changes today." He stood up, straightening his shoulders. "Starting now, we're going to remake this place. New training for everyone. New policies. New spirit." He looked at the staff surgeon. Would you help us? Help us learn? Do better?" Before she could respond, one of the customers who'd stayed to watch spoke up. "I eat here 3 times a week," the elderly man said, standing shakily with his cane. "Never knew this was happening. But I want to be part of the change too. Count me in as a regular at whatever programs you start." More voices joined in. A couple offered to spread the word about positive changes. A local teacher suggested bringing student groups for cultural awareness meals. What had started as a confrontation was transforming into a community movement. The host, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. Their voice was barely above a whisper. "I was taught certain things growing up. Never questioned them. But listening today, they looked directly at the staff surgeon for the first time. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Really sorry." The staff surgeon nodded, acknowledging the apology. "Change starts with being willing to learn," she said simply. "That's all any of us can do. Learn and grow." The owner pulled out a notepad and began writing furiously. "Cultural celebration nights, military appreciation events, community dialogue dinners." He looked up. "These are just the beginning. Every person who walks through that door deserves to feel welcome, respected, valued." Around the room, heads nodded. The energy had shifted completely from the tense moments of their arrival. Now there was purpose, determination, hope. Even the sunlight seemed different, casting warm patterns across faces that had found common ground in an unexpected place. As the afternoon wore on, more plans took shape. The staff surgeon watched her fellow service members sharing contact information with staff members, making plans for future visits, building bridges where walls had stood just hours before. This was how change happened, not through force or shame, but through understanding and connection. A young busboy approached her shyly. "My brother wants to join the military," he said. "Could I bring him by the base sometime? To learn more?" She smiled. "Of course. That's what today is all about. Opening doors, not closing them." What had started as a response to discrimination was becoming something much bigger. A catalyst for change that would ripple far beyond these walls. Sometimes, the greatest victories come not from winning fights, but from transforming hearts and minds, one conversation at a time. As the afternoon deepened into early evening, the atmosphere in Lorenzo's had transformed completely. The owner pulled his chair closer to the group of service members, his notepad now full of ideas and action items. The kitchen staff had prepared a special meal for everyone, bringing out their best dishes family style, the aroma of fresh bread and herbs filling the air. "You know," the staff sergeant began, setting down her water glass, "in the field, we learn pretty quickly that sharing a meal is about more than just food. It's about trust, community, family." She looked around at the faces gathered at the table. "Every time we break bread together, we break down barriers." A combat medic from her unit nodded, adding his own perspective. "I remember this one time in Afghanistan," he said, his voice gentle despite his imposing appearance. "We were treating locals at a medical camp. Nobody spoke the same language, but somehow, when we all sat down to eat together at the end of the day, we understood each other perfectly." The owner leaned forward, absorbing every word. His earlier distress had been replaced by genuine eagerness to learn. "Tell me more about the diversity training you mentioned," he said. "I want to make sure we do this right." The staff sergeant pulled out her phone and showed him some photos from base events, multicultural celebrations, community outreach programs, team building exercises. "It's not just about rules and policies," she explained. "It's about creating experiences that help people connect on a human level." One of the servers who had been quietly listening spoke up. "Could we maybe start having international food nights? I mean, we're an Italian restaurant, but my grandmother has these amazing Filipino recipes." Her voice trailed off, uncertain. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need," the owner exclaimed, scribbling in his notepad again. "We could have special nights celebrating different cultures, maybe invite families from the base to share their traditional recipes." A young private who had been sitting near the window suddenly straightened up. "Sir," she said to the owner, "what if we also did something for Veterans Day? Not just a discount, but like a real celebration, where veterans could share their stories." The energy in the room continued to build as more ideas flowed. The host who had discriminated against the staff sergeant the day before had been listening intently, their face showing a mix of shame and dawning understanding. They began hesitantly. "I've never really talked to someone different from me before." "Not really talked, you know. Just assumed things." They looked at the staff sergeant. "Listening to your stories today, I realize how much I've been missing." A senior officer who had remained quiet for most of the conversation cleared his throat. "That's the thing about assumptions," he said kindly. "They're like walls we build without realizing we're trapping ourselves inside too." The owner stood up suddenly, emotion clear on his face. "I want to make this official," he declared. "Right here, right now. From this day forward, Lorenzo's isn't just going to be a restaurant. It's going to be a place where everyone, absolutely everyone, feels welcome." He turned to the staff sergeant. "Would you consider being part of our advisory board? Help us create something really meaningful here. We could make this place a model for other businesses." The afternoon sun was casting long shadows now, but nobody seemed eager to leave. The conversation had evolved from addressing a single incident of discrimination to planning a complete community transformation. Staff members were sharing their own stories, customers were offering suggestions, and the military personnel were providing insights from their experiences serving around the world. "You know what amazes me?" the staff sergeant said, looking around the room. "Yesterday, I walked out of here feeling hurt and angry. Today, I'm sitting here witnessing something beautiful being born out of that moment." The owner nodded, emotion clear in his eyes. "Sometimes it takes a wake-up call to realize we've been sleeping through our own humanity. But what matters isn't the wake-up call itself. It's what we do once we're awake." As the group continued talking and planning, it was clear that this was more than just a feel-good moment. This was the beginning of real change, sparked by one person's decision to respond to discrimination not with anger, but with an opportunity for growth and understanding. The changes at Lorenzo's began almost immediately. The very next morning, the owner arrived early, gathering his entire staff before opening. The atmosphere was different. Gone was the casual indifference, replaced by a sense of purpose and determination. First things first, he announced, standing in the middle of the dining room. We're closing for 3 days next week. Full training for everyone. He looked around at his staff, making eye contact with each person. And I mean everyone, from the dishwashers to the managers. We're all learning together. The staff surgeon had connected him with diversity training specialists from the base, and they'd worked late into the night developing a comprehensive program. But it wasn't just about formal training. The real changes were happening in small, meaningful ways. The host who had discriminated against the staff surgeon asked to be part of the greeting team for the restaurant's first military appreciation night. I want to face this head-on, they explained during a staff meeting. I need to show that people can change, that I have changed. Word spread quickly through the community. Regular customers noticed the difference in atmosphere, the way staff interacted more genuinely with everyone who walked through the door. The kitchen staff, inspired by the server's suggestion about Filipino recipes, started sharing their own family dishes during break time. One afternoon, a young soldier walked in, clearly nervous. He was using crutches, recently injured in training. Before anyone else could move, the same host who had once turned people away rushed to hold the door, helping him to a comfortable seat. It wasn't for show. It was a genuine gesture from someone who had learned to see people, not prejudices. The owner kept his word about making real changes. He hired a more diverse staff, but not just as a token gesture. Each new hire was chosen for their skills, their character, and their commitment to the restaurant's new mission. The walls, once decorated with generic Italian scenes, now featured photos of local military personnel, community leaders, and families of all backgrounds enjoying meals together. The staff surgeon stopped by regularly, not to check up on things, but because the restaurant had genuinely become one of her favorite places. She'd often find herself sharing meals with an ever-growing group of regulars, soldiers, locals, even some of the staff joining in during their breaks. One evening, a family came in, parents with 3 young kids. The youngest pointed at a uniformed soldier eating nearby and loudly asked, "Why does her skin look different from mine?" Instead of the awkward silence such moments usually create, the host smiled and turned it into a teaching moment. "You know what's really cool?" they said, kneeling down to the child's level. "Every person in here has a different story, different background, different appearance. That's what makes our restaurant special. We're like a big family where everyone belongs." The owner added weekend cooking classes where people could learn recipes from different cultures. The first class was taught by the Filipino server's grandmother, who had tears in her eyes as she shared her family's traditional recipes with a packed house. These classes quickly became so popular they had to start a waiting list. But perhaps the most powerful change was in the daily interactions. The staff started asking customers about their stories, not just their orders. They learned about the base medic who collected comic books, the retired teacher who made quilts for veterans, the young private who was learning Italian to honor his grandfather's heritage. One day, a reporter from the local paper came in to write a story about the restaurant's transformation. "What made you decide to make such big changes?" she asked the owner. He glanced at a photo now hanging near the entrance. It showed the staff surgeon and her fellow service members from that pivotal day, all smiling alongside his staff. "We didn't just change the restaurant," he replied. "The restaurant changed us. It taught us that good food isn't just about what's on the plate. It's about the hearts and minds of the people around the table." The reporter looked around at the bustling dining room, where uniforms mixed with civilian clothes, where languages and laughter blended together, where the smell of Italian classics now mingled with dishes from around the world. "And what's next?" she asked. The owner smiled. "This is just the beginning. Every person who walks through that door has a story to tell, a lesson to teach. Our job isn't just to feed them. It's to make sure they know they belong here. 6 months after that life-changing day, Lorenzo's had become more than just a restaurant. It was a community hub where barriers continued to fall and friendships bloomed in unexpected ways. The transformation was evident in every corner, from the warm greetings at the door to the diverse aromas floating from the kitchen. One busy Friday evening, the staff sergeant walked in for her usual dinner and stopped in surprise. The dining room had been rearranged to accommodate what looked like a graduation celebration. A young man in a freshly pressed military uniform sat with his family, beaming with pride. It was the busboy's brother, the one who had asked about joining the military that first day. He had just completed basic training, and Lorenzo's had insisted on hosting his celebration. The owner himself was serving the special dishes, a mix of Italian classics and family recipes contributed by the staff. "Remember when you first told me about wanting to serve?" The staff sergeant asked the young graduate as she joined the celebration. "Look at you now." The pride in her voice was unmistakable. The young man smiled. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for what happened in this restaurant," he said. "Watching how you handled that day, it taught me what real leadership looks like." Nearby, the host who had once denied service now led diversity training sessions for other local businesses. Their personal story of transformation had become powerful testimony to the possibility of change. "I used to be afraid of differences," they often said during these sessions. "Now I realize differences are what make our community strong." The restaurant's walls told the story of its evolution. Photos showed cooking classes led by grandmothers sharing traditional recipes, military appreciation nights packed with service members and civilians sharing meals and stories, and community events that brought together people from all walks of life. One evening, a couple who had been regular customers for 20 years pulled the owner aside. "We've eaten all over the world," they said, "but what you've created here is special. The food is still amazing, but now it feeds more than just our bodies. It feeds our spirits." The staff sergeant noticed these changes during her regular visits. She saw how the servers now took time to learn about their customers, how the kitchen staff experimented with fusion dishes that honored different cultures, how people who might never have crossed paths were sharing tables and stories. A local business association took notice too. They featured Lorenzo's in their monthly newsletter, highlighting how one restaurant's transformation was inspiring others to examine their own practices. Other restaurant owners started visiting, not just to eat, but to learn. One rainy Tuesday, a group of high school students came in for a field trip about business ethics. They sat captivated as the owner and staff shared their story of transformation. The host, standing tall and speaking with quiet conviction, told them, "Sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the most beautiful changes, if we're brave enough to learn from them." The staff sergeant, who had stopped by for lunch, added her perspective. "Life isn't about never making mistakes," she told the students. "It's about how we choose to grow from them." The restaurant's reservation book was now filled with special events: cultural exchange dinners, veteran support group meetings, community leadership forums. But more importantly, everyday meals had become opportunities for connection. People who might have once felt unwelcome now lingered over coffee, sharing stories and building friendships. Late one evening, as the last customers were leaving, the owner found the staff sergeant sitting at what had become her regular table. "You know," he said, joining her, "I've been thinking about that day you came back with your fellow service members. You could have chosen anger, could have tried to shut us down. Instead, you chose to help us grow." She smiled, looking around at the restaurant that had become so much more than just a place to eat. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to help people find their own light. Outside, the evening was settling in, but Lorenzo's glowed with warmth and welcome. Through the windows, passers-by could see people of all backgrounds sharing meals, laughter, and stories. A living testament to how one person's choice to respond to discrimination with dignity had transformed not just a restaurant, but an entire community's heart. 1 year to the day after the incident that changed everything, Lorenzo's was packed for a special anniversary celebration. The restaurant had been transformed into a festive space, with tables arranged to encourage conversation among guests from all walks of life. The city mayor stood at the front of the restaurant, holding a plaque that gleamed under the warm lighting. "Today, we're not just celebrating a restaurant," she announced to the crowded room. "We're celebrating what happens when people choose to turn a moment of darkness into an opportunity for light." The staff sergeant sat at a central table, surrounded by her fellow service members who had stood with her that day. She wore her dress uniform, medals catching the light, but it was her smile that truly shone. Around her, the faces that had once been strangers were now familiar friends. The owner stepped forward to accept the Community Leadership Award, his hands slightly shaking. "A year ago," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "this was just a restaurant. Today, it's proof that change is possible when we open our hearts and minds." He gestured to his staff, who stood proudly along the walls. The host who had once turned people away was now the restaurant's community outreach coordinator, leading programs that had helped other local businesses become more inclusive. The kitchen staff had grown more diverse, creating a menu that celebrated cultures from around the world while keeping the restaurant's Italian roots. A young girl raised her hand during the ceremony. "My mom says this used to be a place where some people weren't welcome," she said innocently. "Is that true?" The owner knelt down to her level. "Yes," he answered honestly. "But that's why this celebration is so important. It reminds us that people can learn and grow. Now, everyone who walks through those doors is family." The staff sergeant watched as people mingled, sharing stories and food. Regular customers chatted with military personnel. New immigrants broke bread with lifelong residents. Children darted between tables, oblivious to differences that adults had once found challenging. The local newspaper reporter who had covered the original transformation was back, taking notes. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" she asked the staff sergeant. Looking around, she saw the weekly cultural cooking classes had become so popular they needed a waiting list. The monthly diversity dinners regularly sold out. The restaurant had even started a scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in culinary arts. "Sometimes," she replied, "the biggest changes come from the smallest choices. One person decides to be better, then another, then another. Before you know it, you've got a movement." As if to prove her point, other business owners in the community had started asking for advice. The owner now regularly spoke at Chamber of Commerce meetings, sharing how embracing diversity had not just been the right thing to do. It had made the restaurant more successful than ever. The evening wound down with a special moment. The owner unveiled a new addition to the restaurant's wall. A large photograph from that pivotal day a year ago, showing the staff sergeant and her fellow service members standing with the staff. Below it, a simple plaque read, "Every meal shared is a bridge built. Every story told is a life changed." As people began to leave, carrying leftover cake and warm memories, a young soldier approached the staff sergeant. "Ma'am," he said nervously, "I just got stationed at the base. Someone told me I had to come here, had to hear the story." She smiled, gesturing for him to sit. Around them, the restaurant hummed with the sound of laughter and conversation, of barriers being broken and friendships being formed. "Well," she began, "it all started with a choice, to respond to hatred not with more hatred, but with an opportunity for change." Outside, the sun was setting on another day at Lorenzo's, but inside, the warmth continued to glow. The restaurant had become more than just a place to eat. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't force or anger, but the patient, persistent light of understanding and grace. As the last guests departed, the owner turned on the porch light that would welcome tomorrow's visitors. The sign on the door now read, "Where every story matters," a simple promise that had transformed not just a restaurant, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to truly welcome everyone to the table.